Well, hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for another program in our symposium on housing. My name is Kelsey Mullen, and I'm the Director of Education for the Providence Preservation Society. Before we get underway, we want to acknowledge that the Providence Preservation Society is situated on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Narragansett Nation. This acknowledgement reminds us of the importance of place, the continued existence of Indigenous people, and PPS's commitment to building respectful relationships with everyone who calls these lands home today. This year's Symposium on Housing explores this topic in all its complexity. For most people, housing is both deeply personal and inherently political. And together, we're looking at both sides of that coin and thinking about how preservation can address the housing crisis both here in Providence and beyond. We are just now on day 3 of a 10-day symposium, and we are so pleased that you've been able to join us for so many of the programs thus far. We continue after a brief hiatus over Veterans Day on Friday at 3 p.m. With a panel discussion about housing policy. So many of our conversations already have come back to policy and how that shapes our housing landscape. We will be joined by an incredible group of folks from all over the country representing perspectives from academia, from advocacy and action, from sort of preservation nonprofit experience, and also from the political spectrum. I really hope you'll join us for that program, again, 3 o'clock on Friday. There are still tickets available, and you can register on ppsri.org. This particular program on Friday is free. We are also deeply grateful to all of the sponsors who've helped to make this year's symposium possible, and especially to Cornish Associates, our presenting sponsor. This afternoon, we are joined by Elizabeth Korver-Glenn, who is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of New Mexico. And she joins us to talk about Race Brokers, a book that just came out this past April. And it helps fill in a detail of this housing conversation that we really have to wrestle with if we're going to talk about housing. Of course, a growing body of research and our lived experience tell us that where and in what conditions we live has an overwhelming influence on our lives. Housing is fundamentally tied to education, health, wealth, and community well-being. And the residential housing market is controlled by a few important actors in this country. Books like Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law has shown us the roles that local, state, and federal governments, sort of the political infrastructure of this country, how it has wielded its power to create policy designed to segregate our neighborhoods by race, essentially state-sponsored segregation. But tonight's speaker looks at another important group, housing market professionals, and how their actions have worked alongside policy and the law to racially segregate housing as well, not just in the past, but in contemporary urban America. And even as we become more and more aware of structural racism's profound and centuries-long effects on homeownership, resource allocation, and wealth generation, there's still much to do to interrupt the racism that pervades the residential housing market. And we're going to hear much more from Elizabeth tonight. Her research and teaching focus on racialized housing markets, of course, segregation, race and religion, and police violence. And she is going to share some insights with us tonight. We are recording tonight's program, and we'll make all recordings available after the symposium. And Elizabeth will speak for about 45 minutes, leaving time for questions at the end. We encourage you to log those questions in the chat, or your comments, enthusiasm, confusions throughout the program, so we can convene a little bit of a community of learners here and make sure to get to as many questions as we can at the end. We do ask that you keep your video off and your microphones muted for the duration of the presentation, but please do show us your face if you'd like to once we get to the Q&A portion. And so with that, I invite Elizabeth Korver-Glenn to join us here for our program tonight.
Thank you, Kelsey. It's really wonderful to be here with you all. And I want to thank the Providence Preservation Society for inviting me to be a part of this year's symposium. I'm really excited to engage and think with you all about the work that I'm presenting and its implications for your context as well. So in the fall of 2012, my spouse and I purchased our very first home, a small bungalow in one of urban Houston's historic Latinx barrios. The experience was bewildering and overwhelming. It entailed multiple meetings with real estate agents, trying to find a mortgage lender to get an FHA loan, getting confusing counsel from a real estate agent trying to explain what a short sale was, filling out all manner of paperwork, waiting for an appraisal, getting bids from subcontractors, and awaiting the results of a full inspection. Among other things, this 3-month process impressed on me the complexity and the sheer number of interactions with various types of actors necessary for buying a house. Around the same time, I began to realize that prior research on contemporary racial segregation, which, as Kelsey noted, has profound implications for human well-being in our society. The previous research on racial segregation in the United States had one of two foci. First, it focused on top-down or structural inequalities. These included federal, even state, or even municipal level policies and big picture socioeconomic inequities across racial groups. Or second, the segregation research focused on individuals' prejudices or experiences of discrimination. But previous research was missing how powerful gatekeeping actors brought racist prejudice, discrimination, and inequality together across stages of housing exchange and interaction and the actual day-to-day functioning of the housing market. I became convinced that to better understand persistent housing inequality and residential segregation, it was imperative to parse housing exchange as a social process that was deeply influenced by housing market industries and professionals, many of whom I had interacted with in my own experience of buying a home. That is, it was key to examine how real estate industries and professionals influence interactions and transactions, and how racism mattered for their influence. Moreover, previous research on and theories about contemporary segregation largely assumed that the housing market and real estate industries were pretty much race neutral in the post-fair housing era. But this assumption did not make sense given the obvious and overtly racist institutional and organizational policies of the US housing market from the 1930s onward, and what we know about the persistence of racism in other spheres, such as the criminal justice system. So I set out to illuminate specific ways that the contemporary US housing market remains racialized or organized around racism. So in my book, I address these two major gaps in segregation theory and research by asking and answering several research questions, 3 of which I'll highlight today. So first, how and why do real estate professionals connect racism to market activities? Second, how are contemporary real estate industries and organizations racialized? And third, are there alternatives to these racialized market realities? And if so, what are their implications? In order to answer these research questions, I conducted more than 100 in-depth interviews with real estate agents, housing developers, mortgage lenders, appraisers, and housing consumers in Houston, Texas in 2015 and 2016. I also conducted 1 year of ethnographic fieldwork with 13 different real estate agents and housing developers during that same period. And this fieldwork actually brought me into contact with more than 200 other unique real estate professionals. And some of those I went on to encounter multiple times during that year. In my book, I also draw on supplemental archival and spatial analyses, and you'll hear a little bit of that later on in the presentation. And I also want to just note, and I talk about this quite a bit in my book, that one of the reasons I was able to access many of the real estate professionals I interviewed and observed during that year most of whom were actually white, was because I also am identified as a white person. And I'm able to access many of those kind of backstage, behind the scenes white spaces, and was assumed to be kind of a safe interloper. Nevertheless, my goal was to discover and expose what I was observing in those behind the scenes spaces. And that's what I'll turn to now. So first, regardless of profession, whether housing developer, real estate agent, lender, or appraiser, white real estate professionals shared racist stereotypes about groups and neighborhoods of color and positive views about their white counterparts. These stereotypes largely conform to what prior work on racial ideologies and stereotyping have shown. So for instance, white informants and respondents perceived Asian individuals as high status, but also difficult to work with. Additionally, they perceived Black people as poor, financially irresponsible, or dangerous. These professionals perceived Latino, Mexican American, or Hispanic people as being low income or working class with little knowledge about American banking or financial systems. And they overwhelmingly associated white people with wealth, financial savvy and responsibility, and high education. Then these professionals used what I call this racist market rubric to conduct their housing market activities. They were what I call racism brokers. By contrast, and much more rarely, some professionals of color and a very small number of white professionals across real estate industries, except for appraising, we can talk about that later, viewed whites as the best off economically and often held very positive views about people and places of color. For instance, they viewed Latinx individuals as hardworking and having a lot of cash, and Black individuals as tenacious, persistent, and not conforming to white stereotypes. They viewed all groups, especially those of color, as deserving of their time and attention, and they used what I call the people-oriented market rubric to prioritize Black and Latinx people and places in their work. They were racism breakers. Okay, so white professionals are racist and use racism to do their everyday work. They do so in myriad ways as a matter of routine. Some professionals of color rejected such racism and pursued people-oriented visions of people and places. But why did white professionals pursue racism in such routine ways? And why were there so few people-oriented professionals? To answer this question, I now turn to discussing the contemporary racialization of the housing market and its industries. So in short, contemporary real estate industries remain fundamentally racialized. Fair housing legislation did not prompt meaningful changes in the ways contemporary real estate industries are organized or in how they operate, which is to say that each real estate industry is shot through with formal and informal rules, routines, policies, and practices that depend on and reproduce individual and neighborhood racial hierarchies. Specifically, they preserve white status and hypervaluation precisely by devaluing and excluding Asian, Black, and Latinx people and places, and in particular, hinge on anti-Blackness. Why do white housing market professionals trot out racism so often? Because this is how the American housing market is intended to function, and real estate industries and organizations incentivize maintaining the status quo. People-oriented professionals of color were fighting an uphill battle to go not only against the broader racialized social system, but also against the very specific industry and organizational mechanisms that reward maintaining that system in the housing sphere. So although my book shows at least two major mechanisms of housing market racialization within each industry, today I'll highlight just one from each industry to provide you all with an overview. So beginning with the housing development industry, I found that broadly speaking, housing developers working in urban areas began their decision-making process about where to build at the neighborhood level. They used racist interpretations of neighborhoods and neighborhood reputation to select areas they believed would be the most profitable. They assumed white neighborhoods or perhaps Latinx areas near white areas were the most desirable and would be most desirable to white homebuyers, and therefore they would be the most economically profitable. Developers thus focused their attention on these areas, buying land and building or renovating homes, as well as building up local infrastructure and beefing up local home values. And once they made this general neighborhood level where to build decision, They had to find specific plots of land to build on. At this point, they engaged in reverse blockbusting, whether by contacting specific owners in person or via mailers, or placing signs advertising home purchasing services. Developers relied on racist ideas about Latinx and Black homeowners as gullible or as having little knowledge of housing market dynamics. They did so because they believed they could purchase these homes for bargain prices, particularly in areas they believed whites were increasingly buying. Their aim was to purchase low, develop the land for white consumption, and sell high. Reverse blockbusting is a close cousin to what is now known as blockbusting, a now illegal practice real estate agents used in early and mid 20th century American cities. In contrast to this practice from decades past, housing developers in my study targeted homeowners of color, reversing the flow of targeting and property turnover. Developers in my study did not bank on homeowners' racist fears, as did their real estate agent counterparts in the era before fair housing laws. Rather, developers assumed these homeowners would be the least likely to understand housing market dynamics and would be the most likely to be in a precarious economic position that would motivate them to sell their homes at a below market price. What blockbusting and reverse blockbusting have in common is that they both rely on racist ideas that relegate individuals of color to the lowest rungs of the racial hierarchy and do so in order to extract wealth. So Brad, a white housing developer, targeted Latinx homeowners in white areas to find homes at bargain prices that he could tear down to make room for new development. When I asked Brad about why Latinx individuals were moving out of the Houston Heights neighborhood, he explained, quote, "Because they get bought out, right? I mean, I buy houses every day from Hispanics. They move somewhere else. We take their property, destroy it, and build a house for a rich white family to move in." When I asked him where he thought the Latinx families moved, he first said he did not know, but then he guessed they moved to Katy, Texas, which is a large Houston suburb. He then rationalized his strategy of targeting Latinx homeowners for land acquisition by positing that these families had made, quote, "good money" and could move to the suburbs. He said, "They'll just move out to the suburbs or Katy. I mean, they make good money. Usually their properties are paid for and they make $300,000 to $400,000 to go buy a really nice house in Katy, so they can get out of their 2-bedroom bath bungalow that's falling down." Apparently, it did not occur to Brad, who was also active as a licensed real estate agent and had at least one other real estate agent who worked with him, to represent these Latinx families when they supposedly went on to purchase these $300,000 to $400,000 homes in Houston suburbs. Developers' choices then, including those regarding reverse blockbusting, were about maintaining a racial economic order and not just maximizing economic efficiency. In addition to contacting Latinx homeowners in person, developers sometimes make contact by mailing letters and flyers advertising services to specific homeowners. Mateo, for example, kept this form letter in his files. In addition to providing details about 2 options for selling the home, the letter reflected Mateo's desire to build a sense of shared purpose with prospective Latinx sellers, which he emphasized by including his name and personal cell phone number at the bottom of the letter. Other involved stakeholders understood and influenced reverse blockbusting among housing developers. For instance, in August of 2015, I attended a meeting between Casey, a Black developer informant who worked in a predominantly Black Houston neighborhood, and Rob, a white planning consultant. During the meeting held at Casey's office, Rob repeatedly emphasized Casey's need for a better, more concrete plan to acquire land for housing development moving forward. His advice was to use Casey's local knowledge of the neighborhood to, quote, "hold on to land, target particular areas before speculation by other developers happens," end quote. At the same time, he recommended bringing in an outside consultant who would help implement this plan, moving forward and acquiring land from a list of specific properties they had already created. It was important to hire this outside person soon, he said, because, quote, "we need to get that land now so that we can sell it privately at a nice profit. We need someone to do the plan that isn't tied to race, class, socioeconomic baggage," end quote. In other words, Rob was proposing that because of his and Casey's local ties, specifically what he called the baggage of their interracial, intraracial, and interclass dynamics and relationships, none of those present in the room could themselves target the Black homeowners on the list. Instead, an outside person would be better positioned to take what he viewed as a necessary step in making development profitable: acquiring property at a low price in order to sell high, exploiting Black homeowners in the process. Once homes are built, they are sold, almost always through a real estate brokerage and the involvement of at least one real estate agent. The real estate brokerage industry and organizations, including brokerages and real estate boards, racialize the exchange process in myriad ways, including incentivizing real estate agents to cultivate what I call in my book, networks of value to find clients. This means they pressure agents to find clients through their social networks, which for white agents are predominantly, almost exclusively white, and associate agents pay with a percentage-based commission, encouraging white agents to presume prospective clients' social, moral, cultural, and economic worth in their attempts to drum up business. These presumptions draw from widely shared racist stereotypes about people of color and the racist appraisal system, which imposes a racial economic hierarchy on neighborhoods. More on that later. But just as organizational pressures shape agents' networking strategies, organizational pressures influence listing agents' marketing practices. One of these pressures is real estate boards' market area maps, which exist in urban areas across the United States. In Houston, it is the Houston Association of Realtors market area map. This map reinforced a spatial hierarchy of race and set majority white areas apart as unique or special. During my research, there were 98 Houston Association of Realtor market areas that were within or overlapped the city of Houston boundaries. Overall, the area encompassed by these 98 market areas was 20% Black, 41% Latinx, and 31% white. Unsurprisingly, given the very long history of racial segregation, 70 of these market areas were predominantly one race, majority Black, majority Latinx, or majority white. But if these 70 majority race market areas were divvied up in ways that actually reflected or represented the Black, Latinx, and white proportions for the city, we would expect 14 majority Black, 29 majority Latinx, and 21 majority white market areas. But this was not the case. Rather, there were 50 majority white market areas, 2.4 times more than expected. Yes, that's right, 2.4 times more than expected. These areas had about 20,000 residents on average. By contrast, there were only 4 majority Black and 14 majority Latinx market areas, or 1.8 and 3.5 times less than expected. These areas had much larger numbers of residents. The extreme overrepresentation of majority white and underrepresentation of majority Black and Latinx market areas, as well as vast differences in population size across these areas, indicate greater marketing specialization for white areas, even relative to high-income characteristics. I'll go back to the map for just a second. I bet you can guess just by looking at the map where the white neighborhoods are. If you guessed on the west side of town over here, you would be right. Even if you were unfamiliar with Houston, you would be able to tell these are the smaller market areas. They have much smaller numbers of people, and these are the areas that have greater marketing specialization that is completely organized by the Houston Association of Realtors market area map. These market areas hide income and other forms of diversity in Black and Latinx areas, but amplify the uniquenesses of white areas. By requiring and actually automating for sale homes assignment to its market areas, the Houston Association of Realtors ensured homes were advertised in a spatially and racially unequal manner. Once homes are listed for sale and a prospective buyer makes an offer, the buyer usually then seeks out a mortgage loan to finance the sale. A lot of research, including my own, has illuminated mortgage bankers' racist evaluations of borrowers. I also show how bankers similarly enact racist evaluations of properties and neighborhoods when assessing risk. But how do mortgage bankers find their clients? I found that mortgage bankers tended to prioritize networking with real estate agents to find mortgage borrowers, a practice that is encouraged by the broader mortgage lending industry. Unlike what this photo perhaps suggests, mortgage bankers do not simply wait for prospective home buyers and borrowers to come to them. They actively build connections with real estate agents in order to access borrowers, reasoning that successful networking with one real estate agent will be more fruitful than trying to network with many dozens of potential home buyers. Mortgage bankers viewed real estate agents as crucial to expanding their loan applicant portfolios, and real estate agents viewed relationships with mortgage bankers as an important service they offered their clients. But most white mortgage bankers and real estate agents took this inter-industry networking and made it exclusionary, avoiding professionals of color and pursuing connections with white real estate agents and mortgage bankers, respectively. They assumed that doing so would return higher yields. Such segregated inter-industry networking was remarkably similar to how white real estate agents cultivated networks of value among housing consumers. Segregated inter-industry networking resulted in racially segregated professional and client networks for mortgage bankers and jump-started mortgage inequality before mortgage borrowers ever encountered loan officers or loan products. For instance, during my fieldwork, I observed Cole and Brandon, two white mortgage bankers, actively pursuing relationships with white real estate agents and housing developers. Cole, for instance, attended a client appreciation event that white agent Michael hosted for approximately 50 of his consumer clients and professional acquaintances, including other agents, developers, and mortgage bankers, almost all of whom were white. Cole worked the crowd, rekindling connections with people he had met previously and introducing himself to other professionals and consumers he did not know. At a separate event, a broker open house that Michael hosted, Brandon attended and networked with Michael and several other white real estate agents present. There were no real estate agents of color at that event. Brandon also attended a public open house hosted by Jane, another white real estate agent. As he introduced himself to her and advertised his mortgage services, Brandon made sure to give Jane a firm handshake and a business card. Throughout my year of fieldwork, I never observed any of the white real estate agent informants I observed in my study refer a home buying client of any race or ethnicity to a mortgage banker of color. Later, I interviewed Brandon, and he explained the racist underpinnings of his segregated inter-industry networking. He said, so I see a lot of instances that African Americans are applying for a mortgage that more often than anything else, than any other race. I believe there's more a term that we use a little bit more here on the deal, like credit right when they're trying to reach for more for their property, as well as the fact that they're just not as familiar with it. That is, Brandon believed Black mortgage borrowers were more likely to have problematic loan applications, whether because they had low credit, were trying to purchase a home outside of their means, or were unfamiliar with the mortgage process. These beliefs functioned as red flags for Brandon, such that he became suspicious of borrowers' credit risk once he knew that they were Black. And as a result, he did not network with Black real estate agents or clients, and instead prioritized white agents and buyers. So what about appraising? In my book, I discuss the logic and methods of the appraisal industry, both historic and contemporary. Today, I'll highlight the racialized logic undergirding the main residential appraisal method, the sales comparison approach. Although specific aspects of the sales comparison approach have changed with the passage of fair housing legislation, appraisers have been using the same general technique for almost as long as banks have offered federally backed mortgages. So how do appraisers assess home value, and why? Before 1968, federal and industry rules explicitly required appraisers to assess individual home values by comparing each for-sale home to other previously sold homes located within the same neighborhood or in other neighborhoods with similar race and class profiles. These rules primed appraisers to use white homeowners and buyers' racial prejudices as the standard for determining home and neighborhood desirability. This practice, which is part of what we now call redlining, ensured that neighborhoods of color were rated as undesirable and too risky for mortgage loans, and that white neighborhoods, especially those that were higher income, were rated as the most desirable. Individual home values were tied to, inherently connected to, neighborhood racial rankings. A combination of fair housing legislation and lawsuits against the appraisal industry resulted in these explicitly racist rules being removed from appraisal forms and training materials. But fair housing legislation, including the passage of the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, did nothing to address how prior appraisals conducted under the explicitly racist redlining system continued to be used before and after 1977. Homes appraised in 1978, for instance, drew on comparable sales data from 1977, in which the explicitly racist criteria of appraising were still in effect in many places across the nation. Moreover, formal and informal appraisal training materials still used today encourage appraisers to evaluate individual homes through the surrounding area's neighborhood racial composition. In the most recent iteration of the Appraisal of Real Estate Handbook, the Appraisal Institute states that neighborhood boundaries, quote, may coincide with observable changes in land use or demographic characteristics. Further, the handbook directs appraisers to draw preliminary neighborhood boundaries because, quote, the boundaries of market areas, neighborhoods, and districts identify the areas that influence a subject property's value. Then it instructs appraisers to check their preliminary boundaries against the demographic characteristics of those who live inside these boundaries. Through this training, the Appraisal Institute reinforces the idea that social difference is between neighborhoods, not within them. Moreover, the Appraisal Institute states that, quote, focusing on the demographic characteristics that tend to influence property values most in a community is a necessary aspect of the appraisal process. By encouraging its appraisers to focus on the neighborhood's demographic characteristics, as well as the supposed desirability of neighborhoods and determining their supposed comparability, appraisal organizations such as the Appraisal Institute prime individual appraisers to take race into account. Even if it is not officially recorded on an appraisal form, race and racist ideas about place influence appraisers' assessment. One Houston area appraiser illustrated this by saying, well, what we do is we appraise the whole component. So, you know, Montrose is where everyone wants to be. It's close to the schools, it's close to downtown, the medical center, and all the recreation stuff. So the builder down there can charge a $300,000 premium because that's where everybody wants to live. And then up here north of Montrose, it's getting better because of all the Mexican people moving out. So again, once you start jumping freeways and going to other neighborhoods, you're going to have a subjective adjustment of what's the land value and the demand or the appeal of that neighborhood there. The racialized logic of neighborhood desirability and comparability or incomparability then influenced how Allen selected comps and ultimately the values he assigned to individual homes. Or in another example, consider these photos from two urban Houston neighborhoods with similar quality housing stock, location centrality, crime, neighborhood association activity, and so on. One neighborhood, the Heights, is white, and the other neighborhood, Lindale Park, is Latinx. These neighborhoods border each other. Yet consider white appraiser Fred's description of these two areas. He said, as an appraiser, we run into stuff as far as racial stuff. The Heights has always been great because it's the Heights. It's like, oh, I'm living in West U. And just as an aside, West U is shorthand for West University Place, a wealthy white area in Houston. You know, in Lindale Park, it's like, I'm over there in the ghetto. It's kind of scary because if I go by to appraise a house over there, I'm kind of looking around. As for the Heights, I'm driving right up to the house. I have no worries. Appraisers understand and are professionalized to understand white neighborhoods as the most appealing and desirable and neighborhoods of color as undesirable. White neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color, as a result, were not comparable to the appraisers in my study. Consequently, determinations of neighborhood comparability or lack thereof influenced appraisers' assessments of individual home value. These actions are enormously consequential. They mean that in addition to explicitly racist redlining continuing to indirectly influence contemporary home values, contemporary appraisals continue to bake racist ideas into the valuation process. With my colleague, Dr. Junia Howell, I examined home value changes across the 107 largest cities in the US from 1980 to 2015. We found that when comparing similar homes in socioeconomically similar neighborhoods with similar real estate demand, neighborhood racial composition was a stronger predictor of home values in 2015 than in 1980. In fact, between 1980 and 2015, homes in white neighborhoods appreciated $194,000 more than the same homes located in otherwise similar Black and Latinx neighborhoods. Our findings indicate that redlining may be officially over, but in reality, appraisers continue to use racist ideas about neighborhoods to assess desirability and appeal, and ultimately home values. Against the strong current of the racialized housing market swam a few housing developers, real estate agents, and mortgage bankers of color who adopted the alternate people-oriented rubric that guided their real estate practices. In May of 2015, Pablo, a Latino housing developer, showed me around a couple of new homes he was building in a Black Houston neighborhood. As we walked up the stairs of a home still under construction, he described how he had decided where to build. He said, our strategy has always been where there's land and strong community and to work with the neighborhood. We buy empty land and we don't knock on people's doors because I think that's disrespectful. We noticed that between here and Camden Street, it seems like more of a neighborhood feel, and the neighborhood is welcoming. His approach was distinctly counter to the pervasive reverse blockbusting practiced by many of his developer peers. Real estate agents also sometimes went against industry and organizational racialized norms and policies. For instance, Candace, a middle-aged Black real estate agent active in Fifth Ward and other areas of metropolitan Houston, often rejected the percentage-based commission component of real estate brokerage, a key mechanism underlying racist networking strategies. Candace regularly departed from the standard 6% commission model adopted by almost all of her peers. Like some other real estate agents of color, Candace explained this flexibility in terms of her desire to assist her clients, people she knew would otherwise be marginalized. During her interview held at her brokerage in suburban Houston, she explained, "If I've known you for years, I might say, I'll sell it for $1. It depends on the rapport you have. And then each case is case by case, but we don't have a set rate. Everybody here in Houston charges 6%, of course. Sometimes I may give 4%, 5%. If I have a buyer that's marginal, I'll give in. We're not supposed to, but I do because I'm a social worker at heart. I want people to get into their homes. I want to put a family into a home, so sometimes I have to bite the bullet." Candace and other real estate agents of color intentionally networked with consumers of color because they perceived these buyers and sellers as economically, culturally, and symbolically valuable. Although agents of color often viewed white consumers as high value, their shared experiences and awareness of housing market exclusion and discrimination also shaped how they understood value and finessed their networks. Likewise, mortgage bankers and real estate agents of color at times rejected the segregated industry networking strategies of their white counterparts. They networked with a racially diverse set of professionals in attempts to build a racially diverse clientele. For instance, I observed Tony, a Mexican-American housing developer and real estate agent, during my year of fieldwork. One day at his office, he invited a Black mortgage banker, Jake, and Black real estate agent, Shauna, to cast their vision for working together. Tony's welcome of and networking with these other professionals was in stark contrast to white real estate agents like Jane, who actually rejected attempts by a mortgage banker of color to network with her. But approaches like Tony's, Candace's, and Pablo's were very rare, and only a few professionals, almost all of color, adopted them. So among other takeaways in my book, I discuss a variety of directions and implications for contemporary research on racial segregation in American cities. One of these implications is that the usual explanations for persistent residential segregation are inadequate because they ignore the fundamental racialization of the contemporary housing market. And in doing so, they actually misconceptualize some of even the basic things that they're describing, such as discrimination. Discrimination is not just an individual level phenomenon, that it requires direct interaction between, say, if we're talking racial discrimination, a person of color and a white person. That discrimination can also happen behind closed doors when no people of color are present. In my work, I also talk about racial segregation as a racialized process that's mediated by organizational and individual gatekeepers. These gatekeepers are very, very important to understand, as I myself discovered when I purchased a home, and as myriad home buyers and sellers discover every day when they're going through the home buying and selling process. They're, in many cases, totally reliant on housing market professionals to guide them through that process. And in that process, as you saw today and heard today in my presentation, numerous barriers and exclusionary actions are taking place still today amongst these gatekeepers in real estate industries. I also discussed how some racism breakers or people who relied on the people-oriented market rubric worked against this racialized process. But there are limits to what they can do to mitigate racism-produced segregation as long as the housing market's racialized foundations persist. So what can be done about the contemporary racialized housing market? In my book, I offer 3 sets of policy interventions: monitoring, litigating, and direct intervention. For instance, housing developers, and particularly for-profit housing developers, remain almost completely unmonitored. There is no standardized professional licensure and no way to track what they're doing and why they're doing it, or what the consequences are, particularly the social consequences. To be able to penalize racialized practices such as reverse blockbusting, we have to first monitor housing developers. With respect to litigating, I offer much evidence that can support fair housing advocates and lawyers' efforts to sue people and companies for housing discrimination and find creative ways to present evidence for such discrimination. Finally, I offer a number of concrete suggestions for direct intervention in the housing market, including outlawing organizational practices such as market area maps and abandoning the sales comparison approach to appraising and pursuing redistributive justice for the decades of its use that have hypervalued white communities and undervalued communities of color. In my book, I also argue that it is not racial segregation that produces hypersurveillance and criminalization of people in places of color. It's not racial segregation that produces elevated educational equality in white neighborhoods for white children. And it's not racial segregation that causes more amenities in white neighborhoods and fewer amenities in neighborhoods of color. It is people who use segregation as a tool to cause these injustices, and people with great power in the housing market and the industries they animate cause racial segregation through entwining racism with market functioning. Indeed, if some of the alternate people-oriented practices used by professionals of color in my study were adopted more broadly, the housing market would pretty much cease to function in its current form. And maybe that should be the point. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that presentation. I think it sort of shines a light on maybe some ideas that we might be familiar with, or some assumptions that might come from a common sense place, but to see it expressed in one of the largest cities in America at such scale is really staggering. And I would encourage folks to share their questions, and we'll get to those. To start, Elizabeth, I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit about your process and how this study came to be. First of all, how did you identify and find your informants? What was that sort of process of discovery and then relationship building like, knowing that it might lead to some difficult conclusions?
Sure, thank you for that question, Kelsey. So I started the process by building essentially a spreadsheet that included all of the listings within several urban Houston neighborhoods for the month of January in 2015. And I then used basically that database to begin identifying real estate agents that were active in the urban Houston area. And all of these real estate agents, I'll also add, were active across Houston, right? So they weren't just active in urban Houston, although a lot of them concentrated their work there. They were active across the metropolitan area, in the suburbs, and so on. So usually what I did was I would then try to find open houses that these real estate agents were hosting. I would go to the open house and introduce myself and explain a little bit about the study. And particularly for white real estate agents and housing developers, I avoided using the word race. I used the word ethnicity as I was introducing the study, because research has shown that's slightly less confrontational for white folks to use the word ethnicity. And then several of them, 13 of them, agreed for me to observe them. And I tracked them over the course of the year, went with them to many different kinds of events, some of which you heard about in the presentation. These included open houses, they included client appreciation events, they included going to city planning and permitting, they included going to check up on construction sites, just everyday life with these housing developers and real estate agents. And then I think as the year progressed, many of them, maybe even all of them, kind of forgot why I was there. Sometimes they actually passed me off as their assistant, and I did try to help, when I could. Some of them, like one of the real estate agents, called me his therapist on a couple of occasions. Just things like that. So they just kind of got used to me being around. And I think that's one of the reasons I was able to observe some of the things that I report in my book and in the presentation tonight. And then with the interviews, I recruited real estate agents, mortgage bankers, appraisers, housing developers, home buyers and sellers through a variety of means, including using the spreadsheet that I had generated to find ideas for agents that were active in the area. I drove around urban Houston looking for signs of developers who were actively building in urban Houston. I asked home buyers which mortgage bankers they had used for their mortgage loans. And then I asked mortgage bankers which appraisal management companies, or AMCs, they used to hire appraisers, and recruited folks that way. So I used a variety of different techniques to try to recruit folks. And then in the context of interviews, because participants were guaranteed confidentiality, I think there was kind of that element where they shared very frankly with me their opinions and actions, knowing that I wasn't going to go report them directly to, the real estate board or HUD or something like that.
Yeah, that is quite a comprehensive process. I'm wondering, to follow up a bit, some of the quotations that you shared from the folks you interviewed spoke to this a little bit, but what was your sense of their self-awareness of this racialized landscape and how they were sort of working within it?
Great question. So white professionals were by and large very unaware, and actually there's some really interesting sociological research on racial ignorance that I think applies to my work. Like even on the occasions when I would kind of push back on some of their comments and say, well, what about this? Social science research shows this. What do you have to say to that? They would continue to actively ignore the evidence that I had just presented about housing inequality or racism in the housing market, and would just persist with their explanations, even when confronted with evidence to the contrary. So that was absolutely the norm amongst the white professionals in the study. Amongst the professionals of color, it was a very different story. Many of them reported to me their own experiences of discrimination, both as housing consumers and as professionals trying to work in the housing market. For instance, Tony, who was the Mexican-American developer and real estate agent that I talked a little bit about in the study, was profiled by police at one of the properties that he had built in a white Houston neighborhood. He also had a white architect who refused to work with him in a very blatantly racist way. And many other of the real estate professionals of color in the study reported these kinds of instances of discrimination that they experienced in their everyday work. And that absolutely informed how they approached their work, right? So it was a very bifurcated story about the kind of recognition of these dynamics. And I've presented aspects of this work now in numerous kind of real estate industry circles, and without fail, every time I present, I get contacted by real estate agents or appraisers of color who say, "Thank you so much. We've been experiencing this, and nobody's talking about it." So that, just to illustrate some of the division along those lines.
Gotcha. Which sort of makes sense. Those who are benefiting from the system are less, aware of the way in which they're working within it. So, it's not unusual, of course, for this type of work to focus on, a data set that's manageable. In your case, Houston, where you had some familiarity, it sounds like. But what can we sort of extrapolate out as we look at other sorts of markets? Maybe your, I presume, new home in New Mexico, and smaller cities, rental markets, that sort of thing.
Sure, absolutely. So one of the reasons that I chose Houston as my case study is that it actually has several characteristics that would theoretically lead to less housing inequality, less segregation. For instance, Houston is kind of infamous actually for being the only major city in the US with no master zoning plan. And this is this kind of lack of an overarching and more laissez-faire approach to planning and zoning. At least some urban theorists have said, hey, this should theoretically lead to less segregation. Another characteristic that Houston has is that it's actually now the most ethno-racially diverse city in the US. And many in Houston, many demographers actually kind of use Houston as like, this is where the rest of the country is heading. That like Houston provides us a portrait of both like smaller cities, mid-sized cities, and larger cities are heading into later into the 21st century. And a third characteristic that Houston has is that it's actually a very affordable city. We're talking about housing, and if you compare it to like Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Washington, D.C., really any other major city, Houston is much more affordable. And home ownership rates across racial groups show that. So there are higher percentages of homeowners of color in Houston relative to other kind of big cities, at least. Nevertheless, Houston has a characteristic that is very common across the small, mid-sized, and large cities of the United States, which is that it is still highly segregated. Despite these, these trends, these characteristics that might theoretically lessen segregation, it is still highly segregated, and in particularly, it is highly segregated. That the Black-white segregation level remains high, and characteristic of really any city with a Black population of really any size across the United States. It demonstrates its anti-Black orientation. And so this is what I was trying to figure out, like, how does this happen then? Like, we have all these characteristics. It's really a kind of a best case scenario if we're talking about like city characteristics. And still we have this really entrenched racial segregation, and particularly Black-white segregation, but also Latinx white segregation has been growing in recent decades. And so I'll say that and say, like, if this is the best case scenario, then the other cities that have a diverse population, that have relatively affordable housing, that have maybe less strict zoning or planning regulations, then we might expect to see similar processes happening there. Probably it's even more exacerbated in areas where that's not the case. And indeed, that's turning out to be true. So I've actually done some follow-up work with a collaborator of mine named Dr. Max Besbris, who conducted a similar methodologically a similar study in New York City around the same time I was conducting my work in Houston. And he observed real estate agents and home buyers in New York City. Mm-hmm. And although he was an economic sociologist, he came into the study with different questions. We actually teamed up and reanalyzed our data sets together and found that the racialized evaluation processes in both of these cities, which are very distinct in many ways, were remarkably similar. And we actually just revised and resubmitted that paper, and will hopefully be out pretty soon in a journal called Socioeconomic Review. But yeah, I mean, there's been increasing research recently that's shown what I found was not an exception to the rule. In fact, what I found was really the rule of how things are across housing markets in the United States.
Certainly, Houston's infamous absence of zoning was on my mind throughout your presentation, and thinking about how so many cities are grappling with exclusionary zoning, and preservation is often sort of considered or can be expressed as exclusionary zoning. And in the absence of that, we still have this gatekeeping that is very active and intentional in many cases, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
So we have an audience question that you may not be able to answer, but maybe some of our audience members can help provide an answer. You showed that map of Houston that was divided into sort of the real estate map.
Market areas. Mm-hmm.
Market areas. Is there one in use in Providence, similar to that being used in Houston? If you happen to know, please either unmute or drop an answer into the chat. I would also be very curious, but not being in the housing professionals market myself, I don't know the answer. Another question is about, in your process, did you encounter home buyer education programs? And if you did, was there any difference in attitude within realtors and mortgage lenders who were participating in these programs?
Yes, so I did attend some home buyer education classes, and I think I attended 3 or 4 of them during the year of field work. They're not a random sample, so I can't say, a statistically or empirically generalizable finding. But for all of the classes that I attended, they were almost exclusively attended by prospective home buyers of color. There were just a handful of white prospective home buyers at these classes. And I went, I should say, I went to these classes in different areas of Houston, right? They weren't just like in the same place. Like I went to different ones around the city. And without fail, the real estate agents and the mortgage bankers who, did presentations at these at home buyer education classes were also of color. So absolutely, the sort of the feel of those spaces was very different and much more mapped onto the kind of the people-oriented market rubric that I described briefly during the presentation and do a little bit more of that in the book. But yes, some of the real estate agents of color that I observed actually participated in some of those home buyer education classes, and it was part of their broader ethos, right, of prioritizing people that they viewed as fundamentally ignored and excluded by most of their industry, and in particular their white counterparts.
Thank you. As you share your work, Elizabeth, how are you finding people respond to this information? I have to imagine that you do speak with housing market professionals, and this directly confronts their work and how they do it.
Yes, I have presented this work a lot, mostly to real estate agent and appraiser audiences. I have yet to present this work to predominantly housing developer or mortgage banker audiences, although there have been some of those professionals at some of the presentations that I've done. I will say that the reception has been very different between the real estate agents and the appraisers. Real estate agents that I presented to seem to be very shocked at the state of things, at least that I discovered in my research, and also seem to be more willing to immediately kind of kick into action and say, okay, what do we need to do to ensure that this doesn't keep happening? Many of them are very familiar with fair housing trainings. Many of them have reported they don't regularly have to take fair housing trainings and have identified that as a possible gap. But in general, it's been I should say, a more like friendly reception, like, oh, wow, we didn't know, let's do something about it. And for instance, like Redfin Corporation, which is one of the largest real estate brokerages in the US, has, in part because of the work that I did on pocket listings, which I didn't talk about today, but I can talk about that in a minute. But basically, they're off-market listings that real estate agents only share with their personal networks. There are huge fair housing implications for pocket listings, in particular because white real estate agents have predominantly white networks. So if they're only sharing off-market listings with their networks, that means they are disproportionately excluding prospective home buyers of color. Anyways, so after hearing about my research on pocket listings, Redfin has now forbidden them and will not allow its agents to use them. Similarly, the National Association of Realtors no longer allows pocket listings, although the association has not implemented any meaningful consequences for this rule. And so my understanding is that actually the number of pocket listings has increased in recent months. So it's a rule, but it doesn't have any consequences. So it's kind of meaningless. And then for appraisers, I've presented my work a number of times, especially in the last year or two, appraiser audiences. That reception has not been friendly in the least. In fact, appraisers have been, dare I say, hostile to the research findings that I present from my interview and ethnographic work, as well as the quantitative statistical analyses I've done with my colleague, Dr. Junia Howell. We have gotten a lot of pushback from appraisers, and gratefully, still the Appraisal Institute the Appraisal Foundation and other entities, now including HUD, are becoming more and more aware of this issue and are actually talking about reform, although how meaningful that reform will be, I can't say. But I will say that some of the pushback has died down after Freddie Mac recently, I think within the last month or two, published a report that used its own appraisals, almost 13 million of them between 2015 and 2020, that just have totally affirmed everything that we have been arguing for, and from our evidence and the analysis we've done. So we've gotten less pushback since Freddie Mac published that report. But I think part of the difference is that real estate agents are at least aware of and are used to hearing about audit studies, or at least there's some familiarity with audit studies, which the Department of Housing Urban Development has done over the past several decades. Every few years, it sends testers out into the field to determine if real estate agents are actually discriminating. No such comparable scrutiny of the appraisal industry has existed over the last 40 to 50 years. And I think now appraisers are like, oh gosh, like why us? Like, why the spotlight on us? Well, it's not because something hasn't been wrong. It's just because you haven't been you haven't been under scrutiny. And so it might feel like you're in the spotlight, but really it's way overdue, in my opinion.
We've encountered this with some of our other presentations so far in this symposium, is that just having information, having data, understanding the size and shape of the problem really seems to be the first step in making any sort of change in policy and behavior, in attitude. And we have a lot of work to do in that space to just understand the problem. I have to imagine that COVID and the corollary sort of real estate spike has just accelerated all of these problems, or sort of amped them up even more. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I wrote an op-ed precisely about that topic, and named several of the ways that I think the current hot housing market is especially harming home buyers and sellers of color. So I'd be happy to drop a link to that op-ed in the chat. Would that be, if people are interested? Okay, you can do that.
That would be great. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Of course.
Are there any other lingering questions out there in the audience before we wrap up this evening? And I apologize for the background noise. My canine companion is ready for dinner here.
No worries. I have 2 young ones, and I've been expecting them to try to bang down my door at any moment. So
that is totally fine if they do. Well, thank you again, Elizabeth, for sharing your findings with us. This has been a tremendous insight into this aspect of housing. And I will remind everybody that we have another program coming up on Friday, where we'll be taking on some pretty, hot button issues, including single family zoning, zoning around preservation, historic districts and such, and the NIMBY-YIMBY divide, and so on and so forth. If you like controversial housing topics, I would encourage you to join us on Friday. Free registration still open. And thank you for joining us this evening, everyone. Hope to see you soon.